The sun hung like a molten coin over the savanna, casting long, shivering waves of heat across the waters of the Limpopo River. Animals came and went along the muddy banks, herds of impala, the occasional elephant, and birds by the dozen, all warily taking their turns to drink, ever cautious of the water's most ancient and patient predator. In the shallows, nearly invisible, a large Nile crocodile lay submerged, the ripples of the water hiding his bulk. Only his eyes and nostrils peeked above the surface like two polished stones. His name was Mamba, and he was feared as a silent phantom of the river. His powerful tail, thick as a tree trunk, twitched once in the water, but he remained still, watching. Mamba was old, not slow, not weak, just seasoned. He had survived flood and famine, drought and battle. His skin was scarred, a greenish-gray armor hardened by decades of life in the wild. But even the strongest body faces trials of time. Lately, something bothered him. A terrible ache in his jaw, a persistent pain that flared when he ate. He could feel something sharp, wrong, buried deep between his teeth. And worse, he had noticed more and more birds fluttering away from him, not toward. Perhaps they could sense it, the slow rot beginning in his gums, the growing threat that not even a crocodile could face alone: infection. High in an acacia tree not far from the river's edge, another creature observed the land with a different set of eyes. Tula, a small, sharp-beaked Egyptian plover, darted along the branches like a whisper on the wind. She had watched Mamba before, fascinated by his size and strength, but also by something else. She had seen how other crocs allowed birds to approach their open jaws, how they didn't snap them up as a midday snack. It was one of nature's strangest truces, and Tula was curious. She had never dared it herself, not until now. This morning, something told her to be brave. From her perch, she watched Mamba glide toward a sandy patch of shore and haul himself out of the water with a grunt that echoed through the reeds. He turned his massive body slightly and opened his mouth wide. To most animals, it would have looked like a threat. But Tula had watched enough to know the difference between a yawn and an invitation. Her wings trembled. The moment had come. Tula flew down, her tiny heart pounding against her chest. The grass swayed as she skimmed across the riverbank, landing cautiously just feet from Mamba's gaping maw. Inside, his mouth was a cavern of curved teeth, some broken, others yellowed, and one that glinted with something unnatural. A fish scale, or perhaps a splinter of bone, was lodged deep between two massive molars, and there was an angry red swelling around it. Mamba didn't move. His yellow eye rolled slightly toward her, then stilled. Tula hopped forward, peering into the dark. "Are you inviting me in?" she chirped, her voice tiny and uncertain. No answer came, but she knew he understood. A silent agreement had passed between them. One hop. Two. Then she was inside the jaws of the most feared beast in the river. With her beak, she pecked delicately at the rotten bits between the teeth, picking out tiny parasites that had made a feast of Mamba's suffering. The bone shard that caused the worst pain took 3 tries to loosen, and she was sure Mamba would close his jaws by mistake, end their arrangement with a terrible crunch. But he didn't. He stayed still, even when her wing brushed his tongue. At last, with a satisfying tug, she freed the bone and flew back in a flash, landing on a nearby stone to catch her breath. Mamba grunted. The ache had dulled. The pressure was gone. He turned toward her and made a sound deep in his throat, part growl, part gratitude. Tula tilted her head. "You're welcome," she said, unsure if he'd eat her now or let her go. But Mamba simply slid back into the water, slow and silent as ever, and disappeared beneath the surface with a flick of his tail. From that day on, they became an unusual pair. Not friends, not yet, but partners. Each morning, Mamba would open his mouth near the same patch of sand. And each morning, Tula would come, hopping in to clean, picking bits from between his fearsome teeth. She learned where to land without disturbing him, how to balance even when the river breeze blew strong. In return, Mamba offered her safety. Where other birds were picked off by snakes or eagles, Tula rested peacefully near his basking spot. No predator dared come close. Mamba, without knowing it, had given her protection, and with it, confidence. Other animals watched from the brush, whispering to one another. "The croc has gone mad. The bird is enchanted. Sooner or later, he'll eat her." But the days passed, and then weeks, and still the arrangement continued. One morning, after the rains had poured for 3 nights straight and the river swelled beyond its banks, Tula arrived to find her usual branch broken and her nest destroyed. She chirped sadly, fluttering about in confusion, unsure where to go. Mamba watched from the water. Then, in an act that would astonish anyone who saw it, he swam to a small island of reeds and sticks that had drifted near the shore. With his snout, he nudged it toward Tula, as if offering her the pieces to rebuild. Tula blinked. She didn't understand why a crocodile would care. But she accepted the gift, taking the best twigs in her beak, one by one, and building a new nest near his favorite sunning spot. Something was changing between them. Something deep. Not love, not yet trust, but a growing reliance. A mutual understanding born of pain, need, and respect. And so, the legend began, of a fearsome crocodile who let a bird walk between his teeth, and of a brave little plover who dared step into the mouth of death, and found something more than survival. She found purpose. But danger, in Africa, is never far. And as the rainy season deepened, so too did the threats that lurked beyond the river's bend. Something, or someone, was coming. Something that would test everything they had built. And this was only the beginning. The river had changed. It had always been unpredictable, shifting courses, rising with rain, swallowing trees whole and then falling again to reveal hidden sandbanks. But this year, something felt wrong. Tula noticed it first. The fish she usually found darting in the shallows were gone. The frogs that croaked all night were suddenly silent. Even the monkeys that screamed from the canopy were quieter, warier. The jungle itself seemed to be holding its breath. Mamba, too, felt the unease. He stayed submerged longer, his yellow eyes scanning the surface with more caution than usual. He had lived through decades of floods, fires, and famine, but this was different. Then one morning, the smell of smoke drifted across the water. The scent was faint at first, just a hint carried on the wind. But it was enough to stir old memories in Mamba's ancient mind. He had seen what came after that smell: bright lights, loud bangs, and the terrible machines that dug through riverbeds like predators with steel teeth. And he had seen men. Humans. Tula flew low that morning, her wings trembling against the thick air. As she approached their usual meeting place, she stopped short in mid-flight. The water near the bank had turned murky, not from natural silt, but from something oily and dark. She perched on a rock, coughing from the sharpness in the air. "Mamba?" she chirped, calling out. A long pause. Then, slowly, the surface rippled, and Mamba rose from the depths, his scales dull and his breath heavier than usual. A black smudge streaked across his snout. His eyes, usually calm and unreadable, were alert. Tense. She fluttered closer. "What happened?" "Boats," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly. "Men with nets. Machines. They dig too close to the river now. Pour things into it. Poison." Tula's feathers bristled. She had heard stories from migrating birds, tales of places where rivers vanished, where nests were crushed, where trees fell like grass under the teeth of saws. She looked around, noticing tracks in the mud. Not paw prints. Boots. "They're coming closer," she whispered. Mamba closed his eyes for a moment. They always do. That afternoon, the noise started. Engines growled in the distance. Metal clanged. Birds scattered from the treetops in waves. The earth itself trembled as if waking from a nightmare. Tula and Mamba watched in silence as the first of the machines appeared through the foliage, a towering yellow digger, its shovel arm glinting in the sun. Behind it came men with poles and bright vests, pointing and shouting. And with them came destruction. Trees fell with cracking groans. Dirt was torn up in swaths. The river's edge, once tangled with reeds and flowers, was turned to muck. Tula's tiny heart pounded. Her nest, her new home, was barely 10 branches and twigs, nothing that would survive such an invasion. "I have to move it," she gasped, flapping her wings in panic. "Too late," Mamba said grimly. "They'll be here by sundown." Tula turned to him. "We have to do something." He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly submerged, disappearing into the depths. Tula cried out after him. "You're just going to hide?" But there was no answer. That night, the sky burned orange from fires lit by the machines. Smoke curled into the clouds. The frogs were gone. The insects were silent. Even the stars seemed dimmer. Tula didn't sleep. At dawn, she flew high to scout. The damage was worse than she feared. A wide gash had been carved into the jungle, a road for the machines. Pools of oil shimmered near the water, and trees lay like fallen soldiers across the banks. And her nest was gone. Tula flew in frantic circles where it used to sit, finding only splinters and feathers. Exhausted, she landed near the old meeting place, but Mamba was nowhere to be seen. Gone, she whispered. He left. The thought hollowed her chest. After all they'd shared, all they'd endured, he had simply left her behind. Suddenly, the water near her stirred. Then, splash, a low shape burst forth. Mamba. But something was different. His back was covered in weeds and mud. His scales were marked with streaks of dark, wet silt. He looked like a creature born from the earth itself. I found them, he said, voice sharp and sure. Their camp is upstream. They work by night, when the animals sleep. We won't be safe unless they leave. Tula tilted her head. What do we do? We can't fight them. Mamba blinked slowly. We don't need to fight. We need to scare. Tula blinked back. Scare? The humans? Mamba gave a small grin, the closest thing to a smile a crocodile could make. They think they understand the river. Let's remind them they don't. And so, they hatched a plan. Tula would fly ahead during the night, scattering embers from their campfire using her wings and beak, sending sparks into tents and rations. Mamba would stir the waters near the machines, tipping them subtly, dragging equipment into the current with well-placed pulls of his tail. They created confusion, mess, and mystery. One morning, the digger was found partially sunk in the mud, its treads buried. Another, the men woke to find all their food picked apart, as if by clever fingers or mischievous ghosts. Then came the noise. Each night, Mamba would swim just below the surface and let out a guttural roar, not the kind he used for hunting, but a slow, unearthly groan that echoed through the jungle and vibrated through the bones of those who heard it. Tula added to the illusion, mimicking strange sounds with clicks and calls learned from other birds, hyenas, owls, and even baboons. The jungle became alive with sounds that shouldn't exist together. It became something haunted, and the men grew afraid. Their shouts became quieter. Some refused to work at night. Others argued about cursed ground and bad luck. On the seventh night, a storm rolled in. Lightning cracked the sky. The river surged, and Mamba made his final move. With a surge of strength born from decades of living in the wild, he broke one of the diggers in half, using the river's current and his powerful tail. The machine rolled into the water, crashing with a boom that could be heard for miles. By morning, the men had packed their things. And by evening, they were gone. The jungle exhaled. The water began to clear. The frogs returned. Birds began to sing again. Tula perched on a branch above the river, watching the reflection of the sky in the calm water. She spotted Mamba just beneath the surface and called down. You really didn't leave. He surfaced, eyes meeting hers. I don't run. I wait. I endure. Tula flew down to sit beside him. You saved the river. He blinked. We did. They sat together in the quiet, surrounded by the sounds of life returning. The jungle was wounded but breathing. Healing. And though the machines had left for now, both Mamba and Tula knew the peace might not last. But neither would they run. Not anymore. Something had been forged in the fire and smoke, in the jaws of danger and the courage of a little bird. A bond. Not just survival, loyalty. And it would be tested once more. In Part 3, the final chapter, a greater challenge arrives, not from man, but from nature itself. And Mamba and Tula will have to face it together. The rainy season had only just begun, but already, the skies above the Limpopo were bursting at the seams. Day after day, thick black clouds swept in from the horizon like ghostly herds, dumping endless sheets of rain over the wilds of Africa. The river swelled, gulping down sandbanks and drowning trees. The waters became wild, angry, spinning in eddies, curling in floods, rising until they lapped at the roots of ancient baobabs. To most animals, the flood meant retreat. For Mamba, it was a dangerous test of survival. He had known many floods, but none quite like this one. And this time, he wasn't alone. Tula's new nest, rebuilt after the machines had left, sat in a high crook of a riverine tree. But the rains came so hard, even high branches shivered under the weight. Wind tore through the canopy like invisible claws, snapping twigs, bending trunks, driving birds to seek shelter in hollow logs and caves. Mamba remained in the deeper pools, where the current couldn't drag him away. His body was strong, heavy, made for the river, but even he was not immune to its fury. Tula would visit him between storms, soaked and shivering, her feathers slicked to her frame. She'd land on his snout, wings drooping, and he would lift her gently, so gently for a creature so powerful, onto a dry patch of mud near his resting spot. "You should fly far from here," he growled one evening, water rushing around them. "Find drier land, a safer place." Tula looked at him with bright, sharp eyes. "You think I'd leave you now?" He didn't answer, but his jaw clenched just slightly. They spent those days together, Mamba alert, Tula ever watchful. The jungle was quiet in the storm, as though even the predators had bowed to the greater wrath of nature. Then, on the seventh night, the dam broke. Far upstream, where men had built an old concrete structure to block the river's path for farming, the relentless rain did its work. The foundations cracked, the wall gave way, and the water came. It wasn't a flood, it was a monster. A wall of churning brown, thick with uprooted trees, shattered branches, and boulders the size of elephants. It thundered downstream with the roar of 1,000 lions, tearing the earth open in its path. Tula saw it first from above, a writhing mass of destruction rushing toward the heart of the river. She dove like an arrow through the storm. "Mamba!" she cried, her wings flapping wildly against the wind. He surfaced instantly, sensing her panic before hearing her voice. "The dam!" she shrieked. "It's coming!" He turned, his gaze following the direction of her trembling wing. Then he felt it, the rumble beneath the water. A deep vibration, growing stronger. Louder. There was no time to think. No time to run. "Go!" he roared. "Fly! Fly high, Tula! I'm not leaving you!" she screamed over the roar of oncoming water. But he didn't argue. With one powerful thrust of his tail, Mamba launched himself toward the only possible refuge, a small rocky outcrop that jutted from the side of the riverbank, just high enough to break some of the coming wave. Tula followed, wings aching, heart pounding. The water hit. It crashed into the bend of the river like a fist into soft earth, smashing trees, dragging entire termite mounds under, sweeping away nests and creatures alike. The sound was deafening, wood cracking, animals crying, the thunder of water against stone. Mamba clung to the rock with every ounce of his strength, anchoring his claws deep into cracks, his body wrapped around its base like a coil of muscle and armor. Tula, caught in the blast of wind and water, tumbled through the air, feathers torn, spinning wildly. Mamba saw her fall. With a roar, he lunged. Time slowed. He launched his jaws upward, not to bite, but to catch. She landed in the curve of his open mouth, just inside the lower jaw. The same place she had cleaned so many times before. Then he clamped shut, not tight enough to hurt her, but strong enough to keep her safe. The wave passed. The water surged by in a boiling, roaring flood, smashing over the rock, dragging everything else away. But Mamba held, and in his mouth, Tula shook, but she was alive. When the flood finally receded, the damage was almost impossible to comprehend. The jungle was torn. The river had changed course in places. Whole banks had disappeared. Pools had turned to lakes. Nests were gone. Burrows lost. But atop a cracked and battered rock in the center of the chaos, a crocodile slowly opened his mouth. Tula staggered out, soaked and silent. She stood on his snout, breathing hard. "You saved me," she said at last, her voice raw. "You saved me first," Mamba replied. They were quiet for a long time. Around them, the world slowly resumed. The rain ceased. The sky cracked open with morning light. Birds called hesitantly from broken trees. Life, ever stubborn, began to rebuild. The jungle would recover. And so would they. In the days that followed, Mamba helped Tula gather new materials for her nest, nudging reeds and sticks toward the riverbank. Tula, in turn, found clean fish for Mamba, diving to retrieve them from safer pools before the scavengers could get there. They had faced machines, men, and the wrath of nature itself, and stood through all of it together. But more than survival, more than partnership, they had become something rare. They had become family. Other creatures watched from the brush, whispering no longer in scorn or disbelief, but in awe. "The croc and the bird," they said. "Did you hear what they did? They say the flood tried to take them, but even the river itself couldn't break them." And so, the legend grew. Of a crocodile who offered his mouth not for hunger, but for trust. Of a bird who dared step inside, and stayed. Together, they had rewritten the laws of the wild, not with words, but with actions. And as the river healed and the jungle sang once more, Mamba lay sunning himself on his usual patch of sand. His eyes closed peacefully, a faint smile curling his jaw. On his snout, Tula stood watch, feathers fluffed, eyes sharp. The mouth of death had become a home. And in the heart of the wilds of Africa, two creatures, so different, so unlikely, remained a symbol of what could be built when fear gave way to trust. Not just survival, not just loyalty, but love.